Welcome everyone to the June meeting of the Big Hole Watershed Committee. We'll start out with introduction. So I'm Ken Lynch and the Associate Director of the Big Hole Watershed Committee.
Kim Bowler View, Tom Bowler from View,
Okay, Whiteberry, Gene Peterson, rancher, middle of Big Hole. Howard Varner, I live up on Minor Creek. John Peterson, rancher, Jackson. Rancher, Seymour. Luke Lutz, DRC. I'm Jack Losensky. Talking to you a little later.
Thank you. All right, and on Zoom. Yeah, Pedro.
Yeah, Pedro Marquez, Executive Director of the Big Hole Watershed Committee.
And go ahead, Jim.
Jim Drummond. I'm a retired banker over in Bozeman, but back in the teens and 20s and up until the early 1950s, my grandfather was the herdsman for Mount Haggin, and my dad grew up on Mount Haggin. Pedro, I met you up on the road above Mule Ranch a few years ago, and I've enjoyed Jack's book. And in fact, last summer spent a couple of days wandering around looking at some of those old cabins that he talked about in the book. But I go back far enough, 70 some years over there. I remember when the Flumes were still there. So I spent a lot of time on the Mount Haggin Ranch over many decades. So I'm very interested in the presentation.
Oh, how cool. Thanks for joining us.
All right, so first thing on the agenda is to approve the May meeting minutes. Did anybody have any comments, questions, corrections to the minutes? Okay, so we'll call it approved then. And then we go to committee updates, so we'll hear from Luke Lutz with the schedule.
So if anyone doesn't know me, Luke Lutz, the hydrologist with Big Hole. Most of my primary duties are with the Big Hole CCAA program. So this is the June precip and the stream flow rate. Always put this up. This is our Montana stage map of all the real-time and seasonal gauges in the Big Hole. And then I'll kind of break it into our drought management sections for the Big Hole Watershed Committee. So this is wisdom. It's been a little rough this month. That big peak you see there earlier this week, that's from last week, is from that rain system we got. So the system's pretty responsive, but our base wells are not looking too great. So we're at 32 CFS. We are in active conservation for this section on the phone all day with several landowners trying to make sure we stay above 20. So we don't have to close for fishing, but trying to get that up to 60 if possible. Section 2, Dickey Bridge, we're at 761. Main Rock, we're at 1100. And Melrose are, that's kind of a typo in my mind. It's right around 11 to 1200 CFS. So. And then Tony Shonen, we to the confluence of Jefferson. So this is a Hamilton ditch. We're at 954 CFS. Snowpack, we're getting pretty close to being melted out. There's no observed snow at Dark Horse, really only observed snow from our snow hotel sites or at Barker Lakes. As I said in the last meeting, we kind of peaked 2 weeks early in our suite, and we're pretty much melting out 2 weeks early. And yeah, I mean, really the only snow we have holding is, really high alpine and northeast facing aspects, particularly southwest of the valley, and Beaverheads and some of the higher elevations and pillars. Precip, we had a pretty warm couple weeks there, not a lot of water. We dropped quite a bit from our previous trends, sitting around 83%. And this is the standardized precipitation index for the month, D4 drought conditions for pretty much the entire western Montana, as well as Idaho, Wyoming, so. We're not the only ones dealing with this right now, so. 2 week forecast, near normal and a little bit above average precip. We got a good system coming in, hoping this weekend. It's calling for some cooler temps. Saw lows in the mid-20s and then almost half an inch of precip hopefully, so over the next 3 days, starting Friday. But our seasonal, outlook hasn't changed. So below average precip and above average temperatures. And this is the drought outlook provided by NOAA, and persistent drought through much of our region, as well as some drought development likely in the peripheral of the existing drought areas. So, any questions? Or sorry to deliver such grim news, but
Thanks. All right, next up is Pedro, the director's report.
All right. Dan, I think I'm gonna share it from here just to make sure I'm on the latest version. Does that work for you? I've got it on the Zoom, but
Yeah, is that full screen?
on Zoom it is.
Okay. It's a little small for us, but that's okay. We can manage.
Oh, you've got it up there. Okay. Oh, well, Luke, thanks for that. You're one in a long line of hydrologists that have had to stand up and give pretty dire reports. Yeah, I guess thinking about that, this is something I'll engage the governing board on, but in 2021, the folks in fisheries were sort of screaming their hair on fire about the state of how this is all going to impact the fishery. Obviously, this drought conditions are going to impact the fishery. It's going to impact irrigation. I do have a draft letter to the governor, that we've talked about, the steering committee's talked about keeping the state's, I guess, eye on the need for more dramatic action as far as, how to store more water in the big hole. And maybe there's a opportunity here with the way things are headed to engage, our state leadership in a conversation that doesn't have to be, contentious, doesn't have to be about zombie fish or anything like that. So I'll pose that to the governing board. It doesn't look like we would have a quorum here anyway. So that's kind of top of mind right now. As far as drought goes, I don't have it in the slides here, but John's in the room and will be doing some flow monitoring for us this season, and he's going to be going out to some restoration sites and places where we're interested in understanding how much is coming out of crucial tributaries and into the river. And he'll also be available, for irrigators as you're starting to shut down, especially irrigators that don't have a measuring device. We want to be available to help folks understand actually how much water they are using. And when they do shut down their head gates or turn them down a little bit for conservation, we're in a position to be able to measure that effort and measure that conservation. So the more I think we can do that, the more we can continue to get the story out there to people about the work that the Watershed Committee is doing to try to, hold back, I guess, these giant forces of climate and precipitation that are pretty daunting. Nevertheless, we can only do what we can do in the face of some of this stuff. Keeping it positive and keeping it proactive, is in everybody's interest. So that's where I'm trying to keep things. As far as funding goes, finally, I heard back that the Forest Service money that we have for our Elkhorn project is actually cleared. I'll spare you the details, but we were getting emails saying don't spend our 2024 partnership agreement money, and then our contact at the forest in the regional office all of a sudden got an email from somebody saying that money has been cleared this whole time. So there's obvious misfiring and miscommunication going on at the forest. Nonetheless, $500,000 that's in that agreement is now available to be spent. So we've updated a contract with Pioneer Technical. The next steps in that whole big remedy up there for the Elkhorn is to get a mill building survey done. So what we're looking at now, the first step, before we can dig around that dilapidated mill building, is the piers that hold the thing up are falling apart. So we need to strengthen and basically put some concrete and steel sleeves on those piers to make sure the building doesn't collapse. So for that, Pioneer is going to do some surveying work. They're going to test pit around to see what the soils are like underneath there, do some structural analysis, and get us a design. The money that we've got in the partnership agreement would allow us to contract and get that building fixed. At this point, because of the freezing, if we could get a contractor up there in time, the season is super short up there at the Elkhorn. Ideally this year, that'd be great, but if not, we'll definitely be ready to hit the ground next year and get that building shored up. And then once that's done, then we can really start bringing heavy equipment in and digging around. And it's about 50,000 cubic yards of contaminated soils that need to leave that site and go into a repository. Is kind of the big picture there on the Elkhorn. So we're on all cylinders firing up there finally. I wanted to put in there on some upcoming work. It has been, I've mentioned this before in previous meetings, it has been really difficult to find funding for some of the irrigation headgate infrastructure projects that we have, because they don't have a super strong fish component. It's been very difficult to find a source of funding. I did reach out to this Resources Legacy Fund. Trout Unlimited, Montana Trout Unlimited uses them quite a bit to fund some of the big infrastructure projects that they work on, like the Allendale Ditch up Flint Creek. And I had a great conversation with those folks. They love the project that we have down below Melrose. It's 2 diversions right next to each other that require annual maintenance. And the irrigators are finally on board after a lot of conversation to consolidate those 2 ditches into one. And after a lot of conversation, it appears to be we really have one shot to fund this project outside of some private investor or private donor that just wants to fund the whole thing themselves. And that's the NRCS water management entities grants. It would be EQIP funding and open to irrigators. Basically, these 2 irrigators would be considered a water management entity and could apply for the funding. One grant from the NRCS would pay for the whole project. So I'm going to start pursuing that. Irrigation projects are really difficult to fund, but this one is one that I don't want to give up on. So it's good to hear that that's a source of funding I had not heard of before. That's part of the Farm Bill. What I'm hearing as far as the federal funding picture is that the NRCS is actually going to be one of those agencies that stays more than whole. There's about a $20 billion that is going to remain with the NRCS for into their conservation type programs. So with all the budget uncertainty, it does look like the NRCS is one of those entities where funding is going to remain. So I will keep us plugged into NRCS pathways to fund the type of work that we're doing. We do not have a lot of history with NRCS from the funding side of things. So that'll be new for us, but well worth it. Okay, next up, kind of like this quote, I always try to share something that has come my way throughout the month. And I like this quote by Dan Kemmis, who's a Montana author. You know, the type of work that we do, gathering all these different expertises on a regular basis and stitching together partnerships to get work done, creating a sort of collective intelligence and understanding about our watershed. I think it's pretty special, and I like the way that Dan put it here. on that note, I'm pretty excited about this. I know I've mentioned it quite a bit. For years, we've been working on streamlining the regulations that we have to go through to do simple process-based projects, restoration projects. So things like beaver mimicry or Z-dike structures, putting little rock check dams in ephemeral drainages, trying to restore mesic areas. After a lot of work, we worked with some attorneys. Laura Zemer, formerly of Trout Unlimited, was really fundamental in drafting some changes to the nationwide permit 27. I found out this morning that all of the 5 proposed changes that we worked on are now have passed all of the interagency review, and it's now published in the Federal Register as of today. That proposed change to the nationwide 27, a couple of the key things that it will do, it will eliminate the need for wetland delineations for these type of sort of low tech, people acting like beaver or just trying to enhance hydrologic processes. We were able to convince the Corps that that type of activity is in its essence and essentially a restorative act and does not need, and therefore we don't need to actually delineate exactly how much wetland is there now and then come back and delineate how much wetland is there after the project. That type of permitting and pre-project work was costing folks $10,000 or more per mile of stream, and it was oftentimes more expensive than the work itself. So to get that out of that permit is pretty huge. It also eliminates kind of double oversight by federal entities. So expands the use of the binding landowner agreements, includes the BLM. So basically what this does then is, so the BLM, for example, has written an environmental assessment about the use of low-tech process-based restoration. If we're going to do work on BLM, all we have to do now is reference that environmental assessment. That is a federal pathway that has cleared that practice. And the Army Corps of Engineers then looks at that EA as the federal pathway that's been cleared, and they don't really have to chime in at all on the project. So that's going to cut down the time that it takes to permit these really simple process-based projects by a lot. The public comment period is open now, and so within a month, if nothing dramatic happens through public comment, that will be the proposed rule that will go into effect starting next year. In the letter, the Big Hole Watershed Committee is the governing board. You all wrote, well, I wrote the letter that you all approved and signed off on last year, and so the Watershed Committee comes up as the second signer on this letter, along with other national organizations. We're the only, I think, small sort of regional or local organization on that letter that led to this change. So I think that's pretty darn cool. What you all have done, we've changed federal permitting across the country for something that makes a whole lot of sense. So I think that's really awesome. Okay, moving on to kind of restoration projects. Kind of give a quick tour around the watershed here, starting at the upper river, Selway and Trail Creek Meadows. So we didn't have a ton of capacity to propose a DEQ 319 project for this, but we did support the Montana Conservation Corps to go ahead and do that. And they were awarded some funding to do exactly this type of low-tech process-based restoration work on Selway Creek and then Trail Creek up by the North Fork. These are projects that Ben and I had been sort of scouting and had our eyes on for a couple of years. MCC is going to take it and run with it, but I'm glad to see we were able to support that work. A fish barrier is going to go into Rock Creek here in August, I believe. Ari Miller's contracted to do that work. I've got to get them a contract, but that's all ready to go. Talked a little bit about the Elkhorn mine, so we know where we're at there. Confluence Consulting here on the Smith Springs ditch siphon. Those guys are in design right now. I've just gotten our first invoice from them. And that work is being funded through a partnership with the Nature Conservancy that is holding money for Fish and Wildlife Service for that design work. That'll be going on through the summer pretty much. We are siphoning a big ditch under or over, I think it's under the Smith Springs drainage. So we can let the Smith Springs water connect directly to the North Fork of the Big Hole and allow for more connectivity for fish. After the restoration that we did in the upper part where we restored some degrading peat meadows. So that's all. I'll keep you all posted on that. The California Creek demo area has a design. There's been 2 alternatives proposed, and the Natural Resource Damage Program is now just reviewing what we're saying is our desired alternative. As soon as it comes out of NRD review, we should get that put into our task order, and I'm hoping to get that project contracted and delivered while I'm back in Montana here in July and August. The Elkhorn Preserve project, I am still working on a landowner agreement. I've spoken to the landowner. I think we've got our ducks in a row there, and I'm just waiting to get that draft agreement back from him, finalize it. And as soon as that's done, the first thing that we're going to do, this project is going to plant over 3.5 miles of the Wise River of the Big Hole waterfront on the Elkhorn Preserve property. We're going to plant riparian species, do a couple exclosure fences. The first thing that would happen as soon as the agreement is signed is we would put in some exclosure fencing and put down some weed mat and let that sit for the rest of the season so that it's ready to be planted next year. And the weed mat just kind of tamps down the grasses and diminishes some of the competition that the nursery plants would face first come in the spring. The Campershire Riparian Project, that's a project that Jim Olson's been championing to create more spawning habitat in that Spring Creek. It's really cold water. We did take it out to bid. We got 1 bid back that was far too high in price for what we had funded. We are going to re-solicit. We're going to rebid that project, make a couple tweaks to the time frame that we're looking for. I think we made it a little bit too tight, and get that one out and competitive again. That should probably go out in the next week or 2. And then the East Pioneers Conifer Encroachment Project, that is over 1,000 acres of juniper encroachment thinning. And I am about to sign off on a contract with 5 Star Forestry. They're going to start on July 1st, going to town on that. I did get another about 300 acres on private land between Cherry Creek and the Rock Creek, Lost Creek area added to this project with some foundation funding. So that'll be a pretty extensive amount of thinning that covers both BLM, Forest Service, and private ground all along the Eastern Pioneers. Let's see, I think I covered all of those. I'll jump over to, these are other projects kind of in the works in some stage of design, scoping, or looking for funding. We've got the company ditch off of the Wise River that just needs, I need 1 more small funding source to get that project going. Jerry Creek is the same thing. Just the DNRC has offered us some money for those projects. Landowners are chipping in a little bit, but I need 1 more grant source to get those off to the races. We're working with the Nature Conservancy and the Forest Service in the headwaters of Moose Creek here in the Highlands. And that's going to be kind of a low-tech, meadow riparian wetland expansion project or enhancement project. And it's a great area for beaver restoration and beaver transplanting once the state of Montana has figured out how to transplant beaver and gotten that regulatory process figured out. This would be one of the first areas that we'd want to target for that type of transplanting. The area is just ripe for expansion of beaver and wetlands. The Melrose irrigation diversion, I kind of talked about that one. That's, looking for funding for that. That's, a $500,000 project. So it's a pretty big deal. It's on the main stem of the river, right in sort of fishing central. So finding the right funding source for that. Hopefully this NRCS funding will come through and we can get that project going. That one's been on the design. It's been on the design table for over 10 years for us. So I'd really love to get that one delivered for those irrigators. And I've been scoping another project off of the Burma Road, one of the gullies coming off of McCartney Mountain there. It just throws so much sediment down into the river. It's actually cut off what used to be a side channel of the Big Hole River. That has been totally cut off by plumes of sediment coming out of this gully. It should be a pretty straightforward fix and would be a great 319 water quality project from the DEQ. So I've been scoping that with folks from the youth employment program have been giving us a hand, and John Whittingham, local contractor, has been giving us a hand looking at that and devising a restoration for there. And down by Pennington Bridge, our engineers, Great West Engineering, are in design on solutions there to excessive flows, potentially undermining the bridge infrastructure and county road infrastructure over there. So haven't heard much from them in a little bit. So I'll keep everyone posted as soon as designs are kind of underway. Our mission there is really just to keep landowners and folks affected engaged and understanding what the designs look like, make sure everyone's on board before we proceed. There is some funding for implementation already in the bank with the DNRC's RDG program. All right, that's on the project front. I think I've covered everything. So as you can see, we're still just got a lot of stuff, a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of good work still to do. And on the Mount Haggin, I'll kind of zoom in a little bit on what's been going on with the Mount Haggin Superfund project. It's been pretty neat to write this long-term monitoring plan. So FWP wants to have a long-term sort of guide on how they're going to keep monitoring the sites that we have been fixing for years up there in Mount Haggin. And so it's been quite an effort for me. I've got to go back through, in some cases, 15 years of photographs and find the ones where we have befores and afters. Some of them, as soon as Ben got involved, he was really good about setting up before after photos. Before Ben got here, I was just a mess and took pictures of everything. And so going back to find photos that line up with more modern photos has been quite an effort, but it'll pay off in the long run. And FWP will have a great document that they will go back to every couple of years and revisit these same locations and make sure everything looks the way it should. So as you can see, this is in the Cabbage Gulch area, part of the Mount Haggin Wildlife Management Area on the other side of the divide. But it's been fun seeing the progress that's been made by the work that has been going on over there over the years. So I'll just kind of flip through some of these pictures. This is all in the Cabbage Gulch, which is the first drainage that I've kind of finalized as far as where the monitoring sites are going to be. As you can see, deep incised gullies that have been treated, in this case mechanized. We've sort of pulled all the banks back, we planted it, we put in check structures, and the vegetation has responded brilliantly. Here's another one looking uphill at sort of the main gully right in the middle of that thing. When we first started, we had the idea that just planting woody trees and shrubs was going to fix everything, and we learned a lot through the process. Coming in with some grading, put in some checks, grade controls, and over the years, things just started looking better and better. And now it's just thick in there and wet. So that's all been exciting to do. And I think that's all I've got for updates on restoration and things from my desk. There's a lot more been going on with just projects and contracting, but I'll kind of leave it there. Any questions for me? No?
All right, thank you, Pedro. So next up, we have the steering committee. Let's see, Dean, this is Steve. Anything to say?
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's been no meeting.
Okay,
We're planning to meet with Pedro in person in July.
all right, that sounds good.
July
So-
14th, right? Yeah.
All right. Pull up my real quick thing. All right. So quick communications update. We contracted Carleen Notzel, who's a recent graduate from Montana State University. She just got her master's in fine arts in science and natural history filmmaking. And she also did a really prestigious internship for NASA with the James Webb Space Telescope. And she's working to go through some of our existing content that we've been stacking up for years and years to try and use some of the video footage and photos that we have and turn them into something that we can actually use. So she's doing a great job so far. We're excited to see what she puts together. She's gone up with Ryan Kreiner with FWP and had some footage of grayling spawning. Haven't seen it yet, but should be pretty cool. So if you want to learn more about her, you can visit our website, carly.soul.com. I have no idea how to say her last name, so maybe butchering it. And I did, let's see, how to make this. I want to show you a little video she made, but see if I can just pull this up. Full screen real quick. Well, it was hard to read the text on that in this room, but that video will go up here in the next few days, along with another one she's made, and she'll have more content coming out soon, so excited to see some of that go up on our social media. Okay, another exciting event, or not event, but occurrence, is some of you might remember that Zillion Barnwood guitar that was donated to the Watershed Committee a few years ago. We tried to auction it off on eBay, but just didn't get much response. But we're partnering with Tim Montana with the Wise River Club and Billy Gibbons with CZ Top. He signed it and they are auctioning it off for us with all the proceeds benefiting the Watershed Committee. So auction is now open. It's open till July 11th and it's on their Instagram. And the top bid is currently $3,300. So, and it just opened just I think Monday evening. So yeah, it's going well, and hopefully they'll keep racking in those bids. All right, as far as upcoming events, we will have a table at the Montana Folk Festival again this year next to the original stage. And Pedro and I will be there along with our summer intern, Emma Roginski, who will be coming back. And yeah, it was a lot of fun these last couple of years, hot, but a lot of fun. We're excited to get out there and represent the Watershed Committee and hopefully talk to a lot of people. So we also have our wildlife speaker series coming up. We don't have a regular Watershed Committee meeting in July, but we'll be having this on the third Wednesday at the Trapper Creek Ranch in Melrose. It'll be at 6 p.m. The topic is sandhill cranes, and we'll be hearing from Patrick Donnelly previously with Intermountain Western Adventure, but he's known with Ducks Unlimited. And there will be a potluck with the main dish provided by the Trapper Creek Ranch. It'll be hers. So if anybody would like to come, it's a lot of fun. You can bring a side dish or a dessert if you'd like. And then press and publications, I know these are small, I'll put them in the minutes and then I do try to share them as they come up, but. The main thing lately is that FWP and everyone is worried about the low flows and how that's gonna look for us this summer. So like Luke mentioned, it's not looking great right now, but we'll get through it like we always do. So, and then there was an article, the first article there is about the Butte's work on the Basin Creek Reservoir, taking out the dead trees around that. And then some other articles. Right. Our wildlife programs, carcass removal, like it says in progress, but it actually just wrapped up. We borrowed a dump truck from Benton Lake Wildlife Refuge. And I don't have the final numbers for the carcass removal this yet, but I'll get them for you at our August meeting. And then the range rider program will start July 1st. Again, I think it's like, I don't even know, maybe it's the 14th, 15th year for the range rider program, all with Chet. So that's going well. We are looking to purchase a four-wheeler, likely used. So if anybody has one sitting around that they're not using, let us know. And then funding wise, we've got quite a bit of funding right now for wildlife. We did secure almost $200,000 over 3 years it's through the America the Beautiful Challenge grant, but administered through the Heart of the Rockies initiative in Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. And we also secured $17,500 from the Livestock Loss Board. And then I submitted an additional Livestock Loss Board proposal at the end of May. We requested another $8,500 for 2026. So funding with wildlife, the wildlife programs have been sort of unstable over the years. So it's either feast or famine. And right now we're feasting. So it's a good thing. All right. That's all I've got for wildlife. Dee, did you have anything to add? Anybody else have any wildlife related? All right. Well, oh, new business is next. Is there any new business? No. All right, so well then we will take about 10 minutes or so, get some coffee and cookies, and then we'll hear from Jack about history of logging on Haggin. Thank you.
Thanks so much for speaking, Jack. Just real quick, as a way of introduction, as we were getting into figuring out how to restore the uplands under Superfund, Van Abacadori mentioned that Jack was working on, this work of his retracing and mapping out the old Flume network. And it really was, I think, your work and some of the archives that you dug up where we understood the extent of the Flume network and the fact that the logs were backing up in the log flumes and the water was spilling over. It changed how we understood the damages that were occurring on the Superfund site and why there was erosion happening in places that maybe wasn't happening or shouldn't naturally happen. And it was really one of the key factors that led to the succession of projects and restoration approaches that we took on and led to the sign off on that Superfund site. So it's just an honor to have you talk about that work. And it's been a long time that I've been admiring, the work that you do and the history that you brought to this project. So thanks.
You and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with you about a subject that's pretty close to what I really enjoy doing. I started looking at this area in 1996 at the suggestion of a friend of mine who had been spending some time over here. And I came over and walked around and started looking at what I was seeing and what he was telling me about it. And I said, this is something I'd like to spend some time on. And so I spent the next 25 years looking at the area and finally came up with a composite book that we put together last year, which shows the results of that 25 years of work. when the area was first developed in 1884 by Daly, there was no coal development in Montana, so he was forced to use wood to run his smelters. There was no railroad coming into the town, so he was pretty well confined to that. And one of the reasons they picked Anaconda for the mill was because of the vast store of wood that was available. One of the first things he did was to let a contract with a group called McCune and Caplice to provide firewood to run the smelters. He wanted 75,000 cords a year provided for that operation. The other big sale that occurred here was this one here by a guy by the name of Allen, who worked there in 1905. By that time, the coal had been developed and was being brought into Anaconda. And so there wasn't any real need for the amount of wood that Daly was using in the smelter. And so he terminated the original contract. And they had produced something like 1 million cords of wood that were burnt in the smelter operation between 1884 and 1896. Allen came in about 1905 because he had heard that Daly was continually expanding his mining operation. And so therefore he had strong demand for poles and stalls and lighting for use in the mines to line the tunnels and so on. So he began in 1905. Unfortunately, that was the same year the Forest Service was formed, and he got caught logging in the area over the hill in Deep Creek. Had accomplished all his cutting before anybody caught him, and it took years before they finally were able to use some settlement on that event. But anyway, before they began the operation, they needed to provide a system of getting the wood to town. They certainly couldn't use horses and wagons because the distance was a little too far for that kind of a approach. And the easiest way to move material at that time was with water. So they developed a system of water flumes that they used to float the material into the Anaconda. This is a picture of the crew, the survey crew that Allen used to line out where the trail was going to go for the flume. You can see Sugarloaf Mountain in the background, and you'll notice that this area has pretty well been cut over already. That was done by McCune in his original operation. So Allen had to go through that area with his flume, and then he logged into the California and American Creek drainages while McCune worked on the Mill Creek side and then over on 6 Mile, 7 Mile, and 12-mile drainages. This is McCune's operation crossing the Continental Divide in 1887. The whole gang is there, and the complete and a guy named Davidson and all the backers for the operation. And this was all hand dug and with the use of horses. And this is Allen's crossing just past the Continental Divide. And again, after about 15 years, they're still using shovels and horses to do work. So there really is no difference between the two operations as far as how they were accomplished. It was all shovel work, and we can have the next picture. So they would use plow and break up the ground and then come in with a slip, which is this is upside down. And they would use this to pick up the dirt and move it out, pulled by a horse. Everything was a lot of manpower and maybe 1 or 2 horses. To get wood to construct the flume, they needed to have a supply on site. And so they did it in a leapfrog process. And they start at the bottom and go up the length so far up through a patch of big sized trees like Douglas fir and spruce and set up a portable sawmill there. This particular one is on Allen's operation in what was referred to as Camp 2 in American Creek. And they would harvest the trees, cut boards, and then start constructing the flume there. Put water in it and then float the material down the flume to where they were working, and they would leapfrog down until they connected back up with where they had let off the last time. Once that was connected, they would dismantle the sawmill and move it on up the track. They had prefab parts of the construction at the mill, and this is a form that was used to show the boards would be nailed onto these pieces, and then this would be set up on the ground, and either on a trestle or on the ground itself, depending on whether they were in a cut or fill situation. Here you can see the men walking down the hill with the prefab sections, the stack of wood over here that they had floated down the flume. You can see the water pouring out the side. They're just let go down the side of the hill. And this may have been some of their erosion issues that they had years later. And they were constructing the continuation of the flume. This was a lot of manpower. There had to be a right-of-way cut through the ground, and all the cut and fill had to be done before they got to this stage. When it came to a major draw, they had to do a trestling operation. Can you imagine putting this together without a computer? This first tier down here, each one of those sections had to be built individually because the ground was a different level, and so the length of the lanes had to be adjusted, and then the whole thing had to have the slope that they were going to run the flume on. So that the original piece down here was where all the corrections were made, and this is all hand done with a maybe a horse to help lift things up. Once the low section was completed, then they could prefab these sections on the second or third tier, depending on how high you had to go. And you can see that they have them laid out here, ready to set up and put in place. There's 11 guys scattered around the scaffolding here, putting this together with one horse. This not only has the slope of the ground, the slope of the flume itself, plus the curve of the landscape, they have to account for to make sure that the water flows downhill. This, to me, is just an amazing piece of work that a bunch of guys were able to do on something like this. This shows the completed trestle. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections that they put up with a horse to lift it up onto that. This one here is about 72 feet tall, and the longest one was about 775 feet long to cross the area.
You know where this one was?
Mhm.
Do you know where that one trestle was?
That one there, I think that might be in Crooked John Creek.
Look at John.
Yeah, there's nothing left of these trestles. I think after they abandoned the sale and left people in and harvested material for firewood, because you would think there would be a huge pile of stuff there. I did not find that in any of the draw. Well, when Allen crossed over onto the Deep Creek side of the divide, his flume was mid-slope. So the material that was above the flume, that was easy to bring down, just like it had been on the Mill Creek side. But everything below the flume had to be brought up. And with horses, this was somewhat limited in what they were able to do. So they would install a tram, and this little railroad that they would build on the straight line down the fall line of the hill, and lay in rails and have a little train of cars, and they would raise and lower them with a steam engine that they had set up on the hill. Here's one of the steam engines being installed with a big spool of cable there. This particular one was on the American Creek area of Allen's operation, and it was a 1.25 miles long. And they would run that cable down to wherever they were loading out at, hook the cars up, load the cars, and bring them up to the operation. This is all before they even begin to do any logging.
Jack, they had a telephone system set up on that, so they know when to raise and lower the car.
I found a big A batteries and insulators.
Yeah.
And one of the pictures I have showed a line of some telephone line on it. This is that same train that they were showing being built. You can see they cleared that and everything is gone. You'll note on the rollers that they had, these were to use to protect the rail or the cross ties, and the wear of the cable has worn into those wooden rollers to the point where it's even in time cuts through them. But that particular train is about 1.25 miles long. One of McCune's trams was 2 miles long, or excuse me, 1.5 miles long, and it was composed of 2 different sections. You would run down to a sort of a flat spot on the hill and have a secondary train that went from there on down. So they would pull it up to that station, and using horses, they would run it through a switching system, hook it onto the upper tram, and then pull it up to the top to get it into the flume. In some places, they were able to use wood chutes or log chutes to move the material down. On real steep ground, this is a common. I found one of these in American Creek, and there was one on the Deep Creek side in Clear Creek where they had to use a chute for their movement. Here you can see the chute coming down. They had a reservoir at the bottom in American Creek, and they would shoot those into the reservoir. And then, give me the next. They would have an outlet here where they would feed the material through the outlet into the flume, and it would continue on down. McCune also had a reservoir, but he did not have any shoots in this particular area. This is in 10 Mile Creek, and he had a huge reservoir there for water storage. And they would have the head gate here, and they would fill this up with water during the spring years, and then at the late period, they would have enough water to keep the flume going. These things were very leaky, and so every time they crossed the creek, they would have a feeder coming in to add more water back into the system because their system was pretty much leaky. This is one of the longest sections of trestle on McCune's side of the hill. And remember, he's just cutting firewood. So these are stacks of firewood scattered through the hill. The trestle crossing 10 Mile Creek is one of the longest ones I've seen. Of course, there's nothing left, so I can't tell you exactly how long that was, but it looks pretty big. 10 Mile Creek? Right here is one of the loggers' cabins. where they lived while they were doing the work there.
So there's nothing left archaeological for any of this? I mean, I can't.
None of those, they're all gone. It just amazes me how much they were able to get rid of. This is what they referred to as the S curves on the McCune side, and this would be in a 7 or 10 mile creek area. But you can look at the amount of engineering that it took just to get that thing on the ground in 1884. Just an amazing piece of work. There's a string of horses and mules here that are packing wood and firewood up the hill to the flume. They would use horses in areas where either the topography was hard on getting into it with other kind of equipment, or with just a small pocket that they would bring up and down. A horse could pack about a quarter of a cord of wood up the hills. This is one of finished line of Allen's, and here you can see the telephone line running along there, providing the information so people knew what was going on. The other thing they did, at the end of the day, the last log or piece of firewood that was set down, they would nail a twig, a branch of a tree onto. And so as it went down through the system, the flume tenders who watched to make sure everything was working correctly, they would pass them and they would take a hammer and bang on the flume, and that would echo. And the guy that was on down the trail about 2 miles, he could hear that, and he knew the last log was coming. And so as it went down the mountain, they would bang, and finally they would get to the bottom. When that occurred, well, then they could cut off the water for the day. This is a crossing of Allen's Flume on the Continental Divide. You can see this is huge old logging of one side hill. When Allen first started working on building the flume, he had a big tent camp that he used to house his people. Both McCune and Allen contracted out their construction for the flume. Now, while some of the wood choppers might have been involved in that, they normally did not do any construction themselves unless they happened to pick it up as a job before they got involved with cutting trees. Well, we got the flumes in place. There was about 74 miles of flume built in Deep Creek and Mill Creek over the period between 1884 and 1917. The work was done by individuals who used a handsaw, one-man handsaw, and an axe. Excuse me. The trees were typically felled with the axe, and that cuts the length with a cross cut. The guys usually work by themselves, although they live together in camps. This is a picture of McCune's firewood cutting. It is claimed that there was 55,000 cords of wood in that picture. That wood would not carry the smelter for a year. He would take everything, because firewood you could use just about anything that was laying around out there. And these are stacks of firewood, 4 feet tall, 4 feet long, and forever. Okay. On the other hand, Allen was more diversified, and he was under the control of Forest Service, and so they were a little more control on what and how he cut. You can see he had stalls here for line supports, firewood, and lighting material that was used to line the mine. So he had a different combination of things that he was logging. Unfortunately, nobody had ever tried to manage lodgepole pine in those days, so they really didn't know what to do as far as their so-called fabrication. So they tried different cutting methods, and they tried one partial cut, and all the trees were pulled out. And then they would try strip cutting, and they finally realized that basically with lodgepole, you better put it all down because it was going to blow down if it didn't. These are stalls stacked up, ready to be floated down. And Flume is going down the draw there. Horsepower, of course, was important for moving the material from where it was cut to the flume or to the tram. This is in Camp 2, showing some of the teams that were available, ready to go to work. It's wintertime, of course, they use sleds and material down and decked it by the flume. The flumes were active between May and November. And the rest of the time, of course, it was frozen up and couldn't use it. So they would spend the wintertime stacking material.
And they also use rough lock on their sleds too. And we use a rough lock on them because I'm sorry, Matt, can you? The grade hauling that load of logs down, if they didn't have a rough lock on it, it would push it heavy. And then over the top of that horses. Yeah. I think in some cases they would ice the road. What's that? They would pour water on the ice and make it go easier for the horses. Yeah, but you had to have a horse on the shoes on that horse. Yeah, yeah. Here they're showing them doing some hacking again with the fire on the back of the horse. I should say these are horses and mules. This is the bottom of the tram in American Creek in Allen's operation. And you can see the stalls that are stacked up here. Cars are on the track here, ready to be pulled out. This is a secondary flume. They came in from Upper American Creek around. They would load it up there, float them down to here, put them on the stack or into the car, pull it up the hill to the primary flume, load it in the flume, down the hill to dump it in on the pile, then load it on a railroad car to haul it to the mill. So those logs were handled a half a dozen times by human people. Here it shows one of the trains being pulled up. There's about 5 cars tied together, and you can see the cable. And then it was pulling the material up to the top. And we finally got them in the flume and are headed down to the dump. This is a picture of McCune's dump. And of course, it's this kind of environment. So the end of the flume here, you can see the water cascading out, and then just let the material fall out and build up. They would extend the length of the flume with sections to keep it out in front of the sack. Then they would have railroad cars come in and load the material on and haul it to the mill. Allen, on the other hand, was working with multiple products. So he had fingers, and so each one of these fingers contained different products. Stalls, lighting, firewood, that he would separate as it came down rather than putting it all in one pile. It was really easy to load out of there. Now here's what we would call a hot deck. The material is coming down the flume. They're pushing it out over the deck. And I'm stepping into a car. And the material comes down. The loggers themselves lived on site year round in a cabin that they built. In most cases, the wood choppers would build a cabin where they were working and then move on. When they finished logging that area, they would move and build a new cabin at the new site. And these cabins were pretty crude at best, dirt floors, a dirt for a roof. Thinking was sometimes forgotten, and so they would have been a little airy during the winter period. This particular group looks like a team of 5 guys that are working together. This fellow over here, I don't think is part of the group. He's not dressed correctly. I think he came with a photographer. They frequently made an oven for their cooking of their bread. This is a group of Italians that were working for Alan. This guy has a sign which in Italian says, "This is our oven." March 9th, 1906 is on the sign. And they are baking their bread. Some guy has a rabbit here. I don't know if that's supposed to be supper or he's just showing off his rabbit. This is one of the flume tenders checking the movement of the logs. There was a stretch underneath Sugarloaf that was about a ½ degree slope, which was way too shallow for good flow of the water. And that area would hang up frequently. And so we were talking about the washouts that occurred. That's where a lot of them had occurred, was on that face. And they finally make the bottom end up being loaded and hauled to Butte for the mining operation. Well, today you can find remnants of the material that was used and the cabins that were built. This particular one was on McCune's operation, and it was built near a sawmill. You can see they used wood for the roof. Probably one of the better cabins as far as still being standing that we found. This is an unusual cabin, if you could call it that. There's a fire pit in the middle. There's no windows, and there's a little slits around the top of the wall. And I think it was a sauna house.
Was that cabin there about 8 foot by 8 foot?
Yep.
Cause I seen one of them back up.
This is on the back, on the north side of Sugarloaf. On that, there's sort of a big flat up there.
When I was trying to gather cows, what we went in today, but there's looks like a railroad bed.
That was, yep. They had a horse tram through there. Went right by this cabin. So
They come on out and they go down around because at one time you could see where the flume went over.
Mhm. Yeah.
Right there. That's
This is a little community they call 7 Mile. About a half a dozen to a dozen remain up there that were in McCune's operation. These were tram cars, and I couldn't understand why they would do this, but anyway, after they were done with the tram and moved to a new site, they would pull the wheels and the axles and leave the rest on site. Apparently, it was too difficult to pull those through the woods to the new tram area, and so they would abandon them and keep the axles and wheels because those were the important parts. You'll find these bits and pieces of the old flume scattered through the woods. This I refer to as Allen's camp, probably one of the more complete ones as far as building standing yet. This is in Crooked John Creek. This would have been what we would refer to as a company cabin, where maybe half a dozen guys lived together. And they were built quite a bit better. They had a wood floor, they were chain and a wood roof. So these were constructed much better than the wood chopper. This would have occurred near a track, or would have been a cabin that a flume walker would have used, because the flume walker stayed on that area the whole time they were logging, because they used that flume. This is in camp 2, the only 2-story building on found, the kitchen side, and then a dining and with the bunkhouse above.
That was a ranger station.
Some people suggest that.
It's on the map,
Yeah,
and I have,
a map.
I have a picture. of it.
Yeah. There's a building just by this that might be great.
I have a picture of that with the Forest Service people standing in front of it.
Mhm.
And it's labeled ranger station. Yeah.
Remains of one of its ovens. This is part of the trestle going into John Creek. The boardwalk that the flume walker could use, a little bit left of the structure of the flume. This is the head of Little California Creek. They went up there and logged it, filled the flume up the bottom, and then apparently did not have enough water to flume the material out. And so there's about a half dozen of these stacks of wood out there just piled on the hillside. Another example of some of the old remains. And you would walk through the woods and you would run across these tracks. This is the route of the flumes. When the tram got to the flume, they had to have some way of turning the track so that they could parallel the flume to unload. And so they had little switches where they could come up and switch the train cars onto the other area. One of the skid sleds that used in the wintertime. This is a remains of a sawmill. You can see the flywheel and the drive belt would go from there to the sawmill and what's left. Generally, the area has recovered quite well, except for portions of the area on the Mill Creek side. The soil there apparently were fragile with the smoke damage and smelter fumes. Why this area has yet to recover. And I think this must be one of your areas that you're working on for your demonstration.
That's right. That's the West Joyner Gulch.
Okay, yeah. Just amazing. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Where'd you get all the historic photos?
National Archives in Washington, the Montana University Archives. Some I don't know where they came from. They were through the Anaconda Ski Club. They had a collection. A couple other that I found in various minor areas, 1 or 2 prints, but they were from a wide variety of sources.
You said you just published a book on them? Did you just publish a book?
Yes, I have logging for the company, and I have a few here if anybody's interested.
Can they sell them? There's somewhere in Anaconda and somewhere in Butte that sells them, right?
Yeah, and well, Amazon has them also.
Oh, okay, no, then,
Didn't some of that flume come after come over the continental divide there? Didn't it bounce off the sea?
coming down off the Continental Divide, they come over against the hillside and then down a little bit and then cross back over again.
It was pretty much tight right on Mill, all the way down Mill Creek to the bottom. It pretty brushy. It's very difficult to find any remains in that material now.
It seems like you've put a lot of time into this. When did you start?
1996, when I first started digging through it, I decided to write about 2017.
Jack, Jim Drummond here. I just want to thank you for that book. Having grown up on spending summers and tromping wool and doing things on the Mount Haggin and hearing the stories from my grandfather and my dad and my uncles, and you filled in a lot of the blank spots. And having hiked a lot of that country and looked at those cabins and seen the Flume, thank you so much for doing the book. And this is
You bet.
fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Jack? Nope. Well, thank you so much. This is really interesting. All right, so our next meeting, well, we don't meet in July. We will have our wellness, you can see it's like Melrose, on July 16th, and then our next watershed committee meeting will be here, I believe that date is August 20th. And Pedro, remind me, because we bumped those.
Yeah, it's gonna be conifer encroachment. I think it's Sean Claffey's gonna be presenting on conifer encroachment.
Yeah, all right. So come see us in July at the Wetland Speaker Series event or in August back here and hear about conifer encroachment and what can be done about it. Thank you all for coming. Meeting adjourned. Yeah.
Look forward to seeing everybody at that one.